Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Tiffany Ng, and thank you all for joining us today. We're excited that you're here with us as we unveil some of the findings of the 2022 Giving in Faith report and are joined by esteemed leaders to share in a panel discussion. First, a couple of housekeeping items. The link for early access to the report will be shared at the end of the webinar, and you will also receive an email with the access link. There will also be a Q&A session after the panel discussion, so if you have any questions during the webinar, please add them to the Q&A box. So as a research scientist on Givelify's Philanthropic Research and Insights team, it was an honor to take part in our second annual Giving in Faith report. It is our goal to empower you with the knowledge and the insights to support you as you grow your vision. From products like the Givelify Analytics Studio to in-depth research studies like this report, we aim to bring you relevant data that you can utilize. This year, we partnered with one of the leading institutions in the faith and giving space, the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, part of Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Their purpose is to foster a deeper understanding of the dynamic relationship between faith and giving through research, education, and public conversation. Together, we surveyed 1,376 faith leaders and givers, reviewed over 1,200 pages of empirical research, and analyzed over 50 million unique donations. We're so excited to share the findings with you. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to today's distinguished speakers and moderator. Bishop Walter Scott Thomas is a highly regarded executive and personal coach with more than 30 years of experience in working with church leaders, pastors, and church staff, and in building effective ministry teams. He has served as the pastor of the New Psalmist Baptist Church in Baltimore since 1975. Under his leadership, the church has grown to more than 8,000 active members and moved into a new 4,000-seat state-of-the-art facility in 2010. Melissa Spaz is the Managing Director of Education and Engagement at Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. She joined the staff of Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy in 2016. Prior to that, she spent 2 years developing new initiatives and strategic partnerships for Indiana University's School of Public and Environmental Affairs in Bloomington. Wally Mapolashare launched Givelify, the most loved and trusted online and mobile giving platform, in 2013. Today, the company has more than 1 million donors who have made more than $3 billion in donations to over 55,000 places of worship and nonprofits across the globe. And we are very honored to be joined today by Reverend Dorothy Scott Boulware, who will be the moderator for today's webinar. Reverend Boulware is the editor of Afro News and a member of the executive team where she facilitates the publication of news daily on afro.com across social media platforms, multiple weekly newsletters, and the Legacy Weekly Print Edition. Prior to her role at Afro News, Reverend Boulware served as an urban pastor in Baltimore City, Maryland for many years, where her love of words as a substantial expression of her faith was coupled with a passion for teaching and pastoral care. She's a published author and holds a BA in English and a Master's of Divinity from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Reverend Boulware and our guest speakers.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and I'm honored to be here in the company of these esteemed leaders. As I reviewed the 2022 Giving in Faith report, I found it quite enlightening. We know that the pandemic changed a great deal for all of us, and today the soaring cost of living due to inflation has many faith communities concerned. This study didn't just examine the continuation of the pandemic in 2021, but it also gives insights into the outlook of giving and worship to help now and going forward into the future. One resounding theme that was brought to light is the role that you faith leaders play to fulfill the call of spiritual leadership. Faith leaders take on multiple pivotal roles. You are key to driving engagement, growing membership, and nurturing community. You spearhead technology adoption and are entrusted with the sacred guardianship of the tenet of giving. Your role was important during the uncertainty, and it is your dynamic leadership that helped navigate that time period and bring much spiritual nurturing to your communities. As we look forward, you'll continue to play an important role in both the physical and digital world. As this discussion proceeds, we'll unveil even more findings from the report, but let's get started. The overarching theme of why we're all here today is how the report illuminates your multifaceted role as leaders. Bishop Thomas, you're experiencing probably a bit of normalcy now, although we don't know what normalcy really is anymore, with your increased in person attendance. But that was very different the last 2 years. As a leader, you've led your congregation and helped shape new patterns among your members. And according to the report, it revealed that faith leaders spearhead the transition to virtual worship services, and 71% of organizations reported that their leadership was the driving force behind implementing digital giving options, and that 97% of faith leaders intend to continue offering virtual worship services and digital technologies implemented during the pandemic. Now that your church has opened, what are some things that you adopted that you're finding to be helpful today and that you plan to continue doing?
On this in this forum and on this panel, I've worked with Givelify for several years, and they have been a leading force in helping us to get where we are, and not just in the sense of distance in giving and financial growth, but understanding. And I think your question really provokes that second part. So often we're thinking just about dollars and cents, and we aren't thinking about how we transform thinking, how we change minds, and how we change lives by changing minds. The pandemic opened my eyes to something that I don't think many of us were aware of, and that is how rapidly we could change, how we could pivot in midair. I think most of us saw ourselves, from storefronts to mega churches, as the Titanic, that there was always something holding back the rudder or the steering when we would try to make a turn, when we would try to come with some new idea, some new program, some new project. There was always headwinds. There were always headwinds and resistance to it. And we felt like we were Sisyphus rolling the rock up the hill only to watch it come tumbling back down. But Pastor, I think what happened during the pandemic, at least for me, was that I really realized that even though New Psalmist is a large church or a big church with a lot of moving parts, we could, we would, and we had to pivot in midair. We didn't have time to celebrate lengthy discussions, and we did not have the luxury of sitting in the water until we decided what to do. We had to move quickly because, in my estimation, there was a hole in the ship. And if we didn't find safe harbor soon, we drowned in open water. Mm-hmm. So that the issue was not listening to 80,000 voices, but rather deciding quickly on a direction. So that's one thing I learned. I learned that the leader has to understand the ship can change faster than he or she wants. Now, of course, there are mitigating circumstances. When the water is rushing in, folk don't normally stop to have a meeting, and they don't get upset if you don't either. But it makes us aware that we have to remind folk that we have shifted on the dial. We have to remind folk that the new is not always something to be dismissed or to seen with skepticism, viewed with skepticism. First thing, we pivot on the dime. The second thing is that traditional does not always mean future. That what was is What was is, but it doesn't mean it has to be. We live in the is and we hold on to the was, but to get to the will be, we got to let go of the was. I sat in a session, and Wally may have been in it years ago, with a conference that I sponsor, and the digital officer from a white church said that 65% of their people were giving electronically. That you have to celebrate. This was like 2013.
That's amazing.
And no, this was the year before Wally was there. Yes, 2013. He said to me, 65% of our members give digitally. We had a big snow in Baltimore the year before, the winter before. And it had taken me all night long to get a 20-minute little presentation up on Facebook. All night. And the only giving method I had at that time was bring your tithes and offering and drop it in the plate, or at best mail. That week we took up such a limited amount. And I sat here and heard the pastor say 65% of his members gave online. I said, what is this that has come among us? Robert Scott, pastors in Charlotte, North Carolina, at the time was in Kansas City, introduced me to Wally and to Teo with Givelify. And we began a conversation about giving. We were putting our little toe into the giving waters, financial, electronic rather. But in my sharing with them, they changed my traditionalism to innovation. Sometimes traditions are the last line of defense against innovation. They're the last line of defense. When people can't find another good argument, the last one they say is, we've never done it this way before. And they helped me along with others, develop a attack for that, an offense for that. And so I learned that tradition can be one of the greatest barriers to going forward. And there were a lot of churches who could not get past that. And when the pandemic struck, the hole in their boat was so great that they took on water faster than they could ever move the boat. Mm-hmm. The third and final thing, there's a zillion things, but I'll just drop with these. Third and final thing I learned is that you have to always give yourself grace when you're going in uncharted water. Mm-hmm. You may be brilliant where you were and where you are. Don't ever be naive enough to believe you're brilliant where you're going. I think it was Einstein who said second dimension problems require third dimension solutions. What we had was second dimension problems. I needed third dimension solutions, and from our faith in God. Those come from outside of us. And we have to give ourselves grace when we walk into God territory, because we've never seen these things before. We've never seen what God's shown before. We've never had to answer God as quickly. Mm-hmm. Ezekiel heard God say, can these bones live? But he wasn't prepared to have to answer so quickly. And I don't think we were prepared to answer so quickly. So we have to give ourselves grace for the cumbersome way we responded in this pandemic. Does that make sense? Does that make sense to some of those listening?
It absolutely makes sense. And I want to respond, but you said so much that I can't respond without preaching yet another sermon. So I'm just going to say, pass the Givelify app, and we'll just move on after those great statements that you made, Bishop Thomas. And Melissa and Wally, what are some trends you've seen and believe will help faith leaders navigate the immediate future?
Thank you, Bishop Thomas, for those reflections and for a really helpful metaphor. I think that it is this navigation of uncharted water that has made So I'm going to say something because I think we're all cognizant of the challenge, but it's also made for some real innovation and opportunity growing out of these last 2 years. And this study that we were privileged to undertake with Givelify lays out some of that dynamic change, new circumstance. I think one of the things that I would really point to, particularly at the intersection of religious community and giving behavior, is that there is a new, perhaps even a renewed understanding of what it means for an individual to belong in their faith community. What are the markers of that belonging, of participation, and how has that shifted? One of the things that we discovered in our survey was that 71% of givers attended their places of worship virtually or in a hybrid format in 2021. So in these, we might say later pandemic times, there were ways in which people of faith, faithful givers, were engaging that did not exist by and large prior to the pandemic, but it becomes a new normal in many ways. We also asked about how givers are relating to that change, change in participation in a sense of belonging. And 59% of givers reported that they believe that virtual attendance is an acceptable mechanism for belonging to their places of worship. And to me, this is a very exciting, interesting development because I think it points toward an acceptance and also an inclusivity in the practices of faith communities, reported by membership, reported by contributors, that presses beyond some of the traditional mechanisms of engagement. I think it is that third dimension solution. It is that point of embrace to the innovation, to the possibility, accelerated by pandemic times. I'm excited because I think that it will allow for an openness to engagement and a sense of belonging, ownership, stakeholder identity among a wider constituency for many faith communities. It no longer is contingent simply on physical presence Sunday morning, gathering together. Now, do not hear me diminish the importance of that gathering, but it is now supported, supplemented by a much more robust digital presence. We aren't spending all night uploading one Facebook video anymore. The technology has evolved so that now there is a standard and an expectation about accessibility that I think will carry into the future. Wally, I'd love to hear from your perspective some of what you're seeing as well.
It's very interesting to hear from Bishop Thomas's perspective, because my perspective is that of an audience who did not know that Bishop Thomas spent all night uploading that, trying to figure out Facebook. I just saw I logged on Facebook and I saw the Bishop talking to me and I felt special. And it's interesting to just kind of get behind the scenes of what's going on. Bishop, you talked about water is coming on the ship. I, as the leader, I'm the captain of this ship. I've got to make reads and make decisions in real time. And I have to make decisions that I could live with. But also very important was the grace that you give yourself to say, I'm making a shot, I'm making a call, I'm making a shot. And even if I get it wrong, it's okay. I'm doing my best to make sure this ship does not sink. Now, on the other side of those of us who just log on Facebook, we don't know any of that is going, right? We just log on Facebook. And one of the things I started realizing, at least about myself, was Sunday started to look something like I woke up early in the morning, and please nobody judge me. I may or may not brush my teeth, but I could start consuming different services, right? As early as possible. And all of a sudden, the pastors that I want to call my fantasy pastors, right, are all of a sudden one click away from me connecting with them. And I found that to be very powerful because while we did not realize how much effort went into making that available to people like myself, what we saw was faith leaders who were doing their best to meet the needs of the times, and were meeting those needs successfully. And so when we looked at the data, when we went to this to try to answer those questions, what can the data tell us about what that means? And what we see is that 92% of people said, hey, look, we're there online with our pastors and we're able to give digitally. But one of the very interesting things that we said, okay, now the things are opening back up. What are you going to continue to do? So before the pandemic, we had noticed this trend that had grown almost 3 times, right? Where 1 in 5 people going into 2020, 1 in 5 people was given to multiple places of worship. 2 years later, we try to understand, is that trend still true? And surprisingly, it is. It's now 1 in 5 people given to multiple organizations. So what this reveals to me is that hard work the pastors are doing to create that digital presence is being received by people, and the sense of the need to continue to support those fantasy pastors, or those your childhood church that you were not able to be a part of in the past, or maybe you went off to college and those places like that, you can still continue to connect with the message of that pastor and continue to support them. But one of the things that we also found to be true is that, yes, people want to continue to do things digitally. They still ask for a place to call their home church. So yes, I have my fantasy pastor, but I still want my pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And the opportunity for faith leaders is to lean in and understand that this is there, but it doesn't change the fact that you are the main pastor.
Thank you, Melissa and Wally. Great sharing with us. Melissa, I did want to ask you about another trend. The reports found that faith leaders who embrace technology and recognize the importance of connecting with their congregants had a different experience. Could you talk to us about that?
I think this is wonderful confirmation of something that we at Lake Institute have seen over time and in a variety of different ways, but perhaps again more apparent given the dramatic shift in behavior and leadership choices across the pandemic, which is really that knowledge is power. I mean, I will just say that when leaders are embracing access to information about the affiliation, the attendance, the giving patterns of the people entrusted to their care, their congregants, that information empowers them then to be invitational in a new way and to meet people where they are in terms of their engagement. I think that's true when it comes to access to worship remotely. I don't like to say virtual worship because the worship is real. The service, the preaching, the prayer, but there are different ways in which people might access or engage with that. We can say digitally, we could say remotely. That is here to stay. And it's clear to me that clergy who are willing to take on this space, this dimension of engagement, of connection, with confidence to learn more about the experiences of their parishioners in that dimension will have more success. When we look at giving specifically, we have known for some time in 2019, Lake Institute published a study called the National Study of Congregations' Economic Practices. And in that study, we found very interesting data points, something we weren't necessarily anticipating, which was that clergy who regularly review the giving patterns to their congregation, meaning identifying who is giving what, with what frequency and what dollar amount, people who are attentive to that, we're seeing more significant increases in giving than those clergy either without access to those giving records or who chose not to review the giving records. That the behavior, the engagement of the senior leader in a congregation has a positive impact when it comes to giving behavior. Now, it follows, right? Because that information is power. It enables clergy or other leaders in the congregation to invite generosity, to celebrate the giving that's taking place. We see in the current study, the Giving and Faith Report, not only that people plan to continue to engage, to belong, to find connection by remote attendance or online attendance, but also that 92% of givers intend to continue using online giving options to give to their places of worship. And that 19% of faith givers intend to attend multiple places of worship, often remotely. So that's Wally talking about his dream pastor. I mean, I have to say, if I'm traveling, sometimes I'm eager to reconnect with my home congregation. And so I will, tune in on YouTube or check out the recording after the service. But sometimes I take the opportunity to hear a remarkable preacher somewhere else around the country. So there is always that level of engagement. But I really want to hone in on the online giving mechanism. That percentage, 92% of givers intending to continue using online giving, what that really indicates to me is that this is not a novelty. It's not a solution for a season, but it is something that is a transformation in the way in which people manage their financial lives, and that includes their philanthropic behavior. For many years, I have said that the introduction of online mechanisms of giving is really about hospitality, about lowering the barrier to giving. And when we intersect that with remote engagement in worship or participation in a community, primarily through online mechanisms, we have a very small subset of people who engage with congregations online as their starting point, as their primary point of engagement. What we're doing is welcoming. We are inviting that giving and knowing that this is the experience of givers. Once they have had that opportunity to give in that way, they will continue and want to continue to give in that way. I think allows leaders to communicate effectively and to invite appropriately with as much hospitality as possible to those donors.
Thank you, Melissa. Bishop Thomas, your congregation offered digital services and giving before the pandemic began. Obviously, there was no way to predict the unprecedented space of time we had. We didn't know when it would end. The Giving and Faith report revealed that faith leaders who had already embraced online giving prior to the pandemic or were quick to adopt it early in 2020 tended to weather the economic impact of the pandemic better. How do you believe being ahead of the curve with already having technology in place helped your congregation?
Dorothy, I think my first statement would be that it allowed us to quickly engage the congregation, and it allowed the congregation to see the prophetic nature of the church. I think the pandemic opened the eyes of so many people as to, like 9/11, how quickly your world can change,
Mm-hmm.
how insecure we really are, how vulnerable we are. And persons became aware that at any moment things could change. Melissa used the term of hospitality when she was describing online giving, in a sense, that as a method of showing our hospitality. Two things that people need to see in church, or during that season, one of the things that helped, or people needed to see, three, was one, clarity of vision. Number two, that there was hope in sight. And number three, that there were processes people could follow. They needed to see that. They couldn't get it anywhere else. So they needed to find out that Moses at least knew where the promised land was, even if he was following a cloud and a pillar of fire.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't get into the mysticism of it. They accepted the fact he knows where he's going.
Mm-hmm.
I think being a step up on online giving, to have it in place before the pandemic hit, showed the congregations that somehow we were prepared for this moment. Even though we may not have been at 100 or even at the 65% I mentioned before, but the platform was already in place for them to step on. The church was extending the hospitality, saying we have tried our best to make it possible for you to not only worship online, to not only receive messaging through tweets and texts, but we've also made it possible for you to be able to give. And what we found, and this is to back up one of the things that the study shows, that 91% of folk who gave stayed with their church, their home church.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Right. Right.
And even though people were visiting their online favorite pastors, as Wally says, their dream pastors, they still needed their home, but they were committed to their home.
Right.
They were committed to their home. They talk about everybody, they go to everybody's church, but they gave, even though they gave to everybody, they gave and stayed at home. And where home understood the value of their commitment and had extended hospitality and created a platform for them to continue their commitment to their church, those churches stayed strong.
Mm-hmm.
My brother is a leader in a church that's much smaller, and they were kind of concerned, how in the world will we survive? Their membership is old and the like. They were worried and concerned, but they had started Givelify sometime earlier. You know, in the earlier conversations we had, they looked into setting up Givelify. And he, as he remarked to me in the middle of the pandemic, we are doing better now than we've ever done. Now, most of us just took that to mean money, but a pastor ought to look at what that means. There are more hearts here than I realized.
Mm-hmm.
The pandemic has exposed to me the commitment of the hearts, because I've seen the commitment of the treasures.
Absolutely. I know that you have been around pastors who were commiserating when that snowstorm came and kept us from having church on
You
Sunday.
remember, Dorothy? You remember?
And people wanted to know how they were going to pay the rent that week or how they were going to pay the pastor that week because we couldn't get the money in there. So it's not a new thing. So now you're in a place, you're open again, and you have a physical congregation and you have a digital congregation, and we have this wonderful new word called phygital. And I want you to know that I was introduced to that word when I edited a story written by your daughter, Joy Thomas. That was the first time I saw that word phygital.
Wow, I'll let her know that today.
Let
You
her know
called her
that.
name.
And she got an award for that story last week, by the way.
All right.
But the thing is, we've had the experience of having to
I got to give my daughter a shout out. She's a great writer, y'all. Shameless plug, but call her up sometime.
we've had to pastor congregations that were old and young and far away and nearby. So now you've got phygital and you've got digital and you've got physical. How are you doing that dance, and how are you going to engage all of them together going forward?
Well, the pandemic allowed us the opportunity to start. Coming out of the pandemic is giving us an opportunity to reflect.
Mm-hmm.
We had to save the boat. And in saving the boat, we learned a lot of things. We took on digital opportunities in saving the boat. We started broadcasting, as did all churches, on YouTube, on Facebook Live, on Quicksilver, whatever it was, all these different things. Some people on TikTok, just doing whatever they could to get the message out.
Right.
And we found ourselves able to live out the Great Commission in a way we'd never lived it out before. Therefore, we weren't going now on boats and planes. We were going on microchips and going on ones and zeros all over the world, meeting with people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think the beauty of that introduced us to new language. And initially our thought during the pandemic was, my God, we're getting members. We equated viewers with members from all over the world. Mm-hmm. I like to equate viewers with visitors because I don't know how long they stay, but at least I'm getting visitors. But we were starting to be noticed by people in places we'd never been noticed before. And that leads to a bigger question. And this is why that point about the giving and the heart is so important. And I think any pastor that doesn't look at giving as a reflection of commitment of the heart is missing something. Givelify's report gives you so many detailed pieces to begin to reflect upon how committed the people are to the continuing work of the gospel. If the book of Acts, in its full definition, and I hope I'm not taking too long, so I'm gonna get somewhere, Dorothy. I'm one of them preachers who got to go all over the field. But if the book of the Acts is by definition the spread of the church from Jerusalem to Rome under the aegis of the Holy Spirit, and it's a bunch of people not knowing where they're going or how they're going to get there, not even knowing that the aim is to get to Rome, right, or to spread the gospel in all these places, no clue, just walking by faith in listening to a voice. That's what the pandemic was for us, walking by faith, listening to a voice. God dropped us in the middle of the ocean at the middle of the night with clouds covering the sky and no North Star, and said, swim. And by the grace of God, most of us have reached shore. That's nothing but God moving, saying, I'm with you. Mm-hmm. And so we began to start seeing these churches grow and Givelify, and people giving their commitment to our churches, giving. But it really raises a bigger question. And that question is this: are we trying to build a nationwide church, a worldwide church of individuals who are members of our church? Our new psalmist trying to say we got members in Asia and Africa, in Baltimore, in Baltimore County, in Baltimore City, in Virginia. Or, and this is where reflection comes in, or is God saying, no, I don't need you to have a worldwide membership. I need you to be building a worldwide network of churches. Are we the new apostles? And is the digital media the new form of the apostles' journey? Are we establishing home churches in all of the homes that are now sharing with us? Or are we looking at them as members of our church? I've got so many more new members. Or do I have so many more new opportunities to develop a home church? To do what Paul did in Ephesus and in Philippi and in Galatia. And then as we look at the giving, we will begin to see that people are committing to that message. I would say this is the church apostolic age, not the post-apostolic age. Not where we're just consecrating people apostles, but this is the church in the real apostolic age. And that's one of the greatest lessons I think we've learned. And if we look at our giving, we can see that there is a commitment from hearts to the spreading of this message.
It's amazing, absolutely. Wally, you want to step in here?
Absolutely, but and one of the things that I truly appreciate about what Bishop talked about, like, yes, there's this new audience that we're finding from all over the world. And even as places of worship start to open up, right, the intentionality to continue to nurture that audience while catering to the people in the building is perhaps a dance that I think faith leaders have perfected in the past 2 years. And it was a dance that needed to be perfected for us to navigate the future. But one of the interesting things we also found when we're doing the study was as we started to examine the impact of the church in the local community during the pandemic, there were things that we observed from the outside looking in, and there were things we wanted to try to analyze the data to better understand. And from our own observations, we saw pastors playing a role that at Givelify we call faith responder. And what does that mean? For a lot of people that I knew that were personally impacted during the pandemic, when they got that email or letter from their job about being laid off, the first person they called before they called the unemployment office was Bishop Thomas's team. For a lot of people who had family members who were trying to figure out the vaccine and medication and things that we could do, for the early people who might have actually caught COVID-19, when that test came positive, the first person they called as they were going to the hospital was Bishop Thomas. But a lot of people weren't quite sure how to feed their families. The place they looked to was New Psalmist. And so what we observed and what the data backed is that 82% of faith leaders stepped up their impact in the community. So yes, they're the chief spiritual officers, but now they have to become community leaders as well. And when we asked the people who gave to the church, 97% said, we appreciated that our church did this and will continue to support those efforts in the church. And so we think there's an opportunity here that community leadership, that a lot of faith leaders found themselves in having to play during the pandemic, will continue to help them expand their relevance to the community, their relevance to their congregations, and ultimately fulfill their calling that they do every day.
Thank you. On the same vein, the study found um, that despite the financial difficulties over the past 2 years, faith givers provided incredibly generous support toward the organizations and causes that they supported. Within the faith community that used Givelify, total charitable giving grew 174% between 2019 and 2021. 84% of givers either increased their giving or maintained their giving to their places of worship, and 100% of them want to donate the same amount or more in the future. Can you share what trends New Psalmist experienced when it came to the generous support of your givers? Did it mirror that on the research? And any particular best practice that you would like to share on how you keep your congregation inspired to give in a hybrid environment, especially as inflation continues to rise?
Pastor, you would agree with me on this. When we were young, and I think we might be a little older than these other persons on with us today.
Don't tell anybody.
When we were young, persons gave to the church for the building fund. For the church is building a new building, we're building an annex, we're redoing the woman's room, fixing up the men's room. And that became the big source of giving because we grew up in a generation and among a people where physical plant, buildings, having something was a sign that you were moving along the continuum. And so if I could buy my house, I wanted to make sure our church looked strong and looked like a church. But that's morphed over these years where since we moved into some of the opportunities that society has created, and more of our people have graduated, bought homes and other things, there's something more motivating. And what's more motivating is meeting needs. So that now people don't really give to buildings, they give to needs. They give to a sense, and the reason for that is people want to make a difference in life. They want to make a difference in this world, and they recognize in and of themselves they cannot make but so large a difference. And so they want to join with somebody who's doing the same, join with others. In certain churches, we'll say, this soil is good ground to plant your seed. You've heard that line many times. This is good ground. Well, the reality of that means is, or what that really means is, this is a church that's trying to make a difference in the world. Mm-hmm. And what I found was during the pandemic, the church wanted to make a difference in the world. Now, I didn't always find that the difference we made in the world made the world want to come to church.
Right.
But what I did find was that the church recognized the need to make a difference in the lives of other people and willingly stepped up. Giving stepped up as a result of it. People wanted to help and still do, still want to give to help others. Now, it's not always just giving money, but it's giving, and one of the most valuable things from the pandemic is knowledge. Knowledge, because knowledge was so scarce during the pandemic. True information was scarce. Anytime some of the stuff we heard, put bleach under your arm, knowledge was scarce. And so churches that were giving food, giving clothes, doing job seminars and the like, but also teaching and putting out the truth about the realities of what we were living through and how to live through it, found that persons were gravitating to that ministry and wanting to anchor themselves in that ministry, because that ministry showed, as one of my friends' church motto is, that they were the church that cared.
That's important to know. Melissa?
I really resonate with what Bishop Thomas has shared and want to lift up one aspect of this and then connect it with something that we found in the Giving and Faith report. And that is that givers today including religious givers in the way that they relate to their place of worship, to their congregation, really care about mission. Yes, they're invested in the community, they're invested in support for the institution's sake, but increasingly we see donors, younger donors, yes, but also I think there's a culture shift.
Yes.
Wanting to know that they're making a difference with their dollar, that they're impacting mission. I often say money follows mission. And so when there's clarity on the part of a leader or an organization or a faith community about that mission, and an outward facing mission, not simply care for we gathered here in this community, but really looking to join God's activity in the world, that is the primary object of generosity on the part of the contemporary donor. And so to bring that to the Giving and Faith report, we found that among the primary reasons that faith motivated givers, or Wally said, faith responders, those who are responding from their religious conviction by giving, the primary reasons that they report offering financial support to their own congregation, primary among this is their religious conviction, a sense of purpose. They also care about the worship experience. They also care about giving back to the place that has given to them, but they really do give primarily connected to those deeply held beliefs. We also know from other Lake Institute research on generosity, generally speaking, that religious motivations are a primary driver of philanthropic activity, not only giving to congregations or places of worship, but also giving to human service organizations or to address urgent or emergent needs across the board, whether they are affiliated with a congregation or not. Givers identify their personal religious beliefs as a significant contributor to the way in which they direct their giving. Whether the beneficiary of that giving is an explicitly religious organization or not. So we think even about giving that goes to the Red Cross, say to address a natural disaster. People cite their religious commitments as a component of that. The Giving and Faith study also showed the vital importance of the leadership in the faith community in helping people find footing for that giving, for that impulse of generosity. Fundraisers often say people give to people. And we know that people want to have that kind of impact, but gifts come as the result of invitation. So when we are religious leaders inviting well, we're creating opportunity for people to direct that generosity. I do think that sometimes that requires a shift in the mindset of congregational leaders, particularly clergy, because I think sometimes we see fundraising activity, or what I would call invitation, as a necessary but perhaps unpleasant activity, something that we do as a secondary support for ministry. But what we see when we look at that generosity motivator, faith motivator, is that, in fact, inviting gifts, being in a position to help people steward their resources toward impact, toward doing that good in the world, is in fact a ministry itself. And so for clergy to embrace invitation as a part of the things that they do to care for their congregation, to care for their people, that can be a transformative difference in the activity of ministry, rather than being something siloed apart from maybe what we think of as conventional leadership or ministry activities.
Many of us sat in seminary class Bishop Thomas. And when we were asked about fundraising, we told our professors that we were called of God to preach the word, certainly not to raise any money. But they brought us back to earth because they wanted to know, well, who was going to raise the money if we didn't? So what do you have to say about being comfortable in that role? Because the report reveals that givers expect their faith leaders to solicit funds from them and encourage them to be givers.
The role of the pastor or the leader of the church is to excite the people about the mission of the kingdom and to excite them about how the kingdom is being spread. The kingdom is being spread locally, statewide, nationally, internationally. Sometimes pastors don't like to talk about money, but the reason for which they don't eludes me. But they don't understand that how in the world are you going to do this work of the kingdom without exciting the people about it? Once you excite them about what's happening, they will want to give to make it go forward. It took time spent with capital fundraisers for me to understand that there's a science to giving. It's not just an art form of, oh, my brothers and sisters, let's give. No, there's a science to it. You have to understand that people are motivated to be involved and motivated to work. And we have to learn how to speak the language of motivation. Sometimes, and that doesn't mean it has to be anti-spiritual, but we have to learn to want to motivate people to be involved. Jesus didn't have a place to even lay his head. How do we think he did ministry? He didn't have a bed. He didn't have a house. How do we think he did ministry? He did it by inspiring people to give to the work. And the Bible talks about folk giving to the work. And that's our role. Somebody say, well, I don't like to do that. Well, then you're not going to accomplish much for God. It's not going to be done much. I just need to tell you straight up, you ain't going to get much done. But if you do understand that God will give you the words and give you the spirit to speak it, then things will happen. Spirit draws spirit. Spirit draws spirit. When your spirit is attuned to God and you speak of the will of God in your life and what God is doing through you in the world, people want to join that. And that's why the platforms like Givelify are so important, because you're saying to folk, you can do it at any time, day or night. Whenever this crosses your mind and you want to be involved in it, you can. You can give in the middle of the night if you want. You can wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, I want to share. You have a dream and wake up and say, I need to do more, and do it. But it starts with a pastor committed to making sure the kingdom is advanced. And in doing that, folks will come along.
Thank you so much. We want to try to get a couple of the questions, and we have some from our participants this morning. Pastor Lynn Taylor from Gwinnett Oak, Maryland says, it's great, insightful conversation. Is there any data that speaks particularly to trends in smaller ministries? Can you help us with that, Wally or Melissa?
Just very briefly. Oh, Bishop,
I just want to say something
Thomas,
anecdotally. I serve over a series of churches, but I'm connected to a lot of other churches. And I have spoken with small churches that have used Givelify. And they have said without a shadow of a doubt, without that, they would have been dead in the water. And many of them were grateful they had started it before the pandemic, because their systems were not that expansive. And so if they had waited till the pandemic, they would have been struggling against some insurmountable odds. But that was one piece already in place. And many of them reported that their finances were better during the pandemic than they were when they were open.
Mm-hmm.
That's anecdotal. Melissa, I turn to you now.
I think you've pointed to exactly what the social science research would show, which is that this is a necessary component and that it is an advantage for congregations of all size. Small membership churches were much less likely to have had a mechanism for electronic giving in place prior to the pandemic. There were a significant number that did not have that mechanism, say in February of 2020, and then adopted it by May. And that is a lifeline for many congregations. Again, I would just return to that expectation of hospitality and say that it is really about making accessible the opportunity to give in the way in which people are able to do that.
Thank you
And
so
if I
much.
could just quickly make a quick point on that, in the report itself, a lot of the smaller churches were represented there, just so that we could get a very good population sample of smaller, mid, and large churches. And so one thing just holds true. Majority of the churches are going to keep a lot of the things that they learned during the pandemic. They're going to keep doing those things even as they open their doors for in-place worship. And digital giving is one of those things. Now, the opportunity is people have learned how to give digitally. When we're crafting those in worship experience, how do we make sure that those who might give on their phone, for example, are feel included, right? So if we're dancing to the altar as part of our giving experience, or for passing the plate about the giving experience, what are some little things we can do to make sure they don't feel left out of that experience, right? Because it matters to people. They want to be part of that social celebration of the giving. We've seen churches that ask people to wave their phones or tap the offering plate with their phones. Simple things like that to just help people feel included as a good member of the church.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this great discussion. And I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Ng.
Thank you all again for joining us today for our 2022 Giving in Faith webinar. Please download a copy of the report by visiting givelify.com/givinginfaith or by clicking on that pop-up that appeared on the screen. You'll also get an email with a link to the recording and the information about the report later today. If we didn't get to your questions today, we'll follow up directly with you via email. And we'll also have a brief survey after this webinar ends. We'd love to hear your thoughts and see how we can improve in the future. If you have any questions about Givelify, you can also reach out to support@givelify.com at any time. Thank you again for joining us, and a very, very heartfelt thank you again to all of our speakers. Have a nice day.